Hello, everyone. This is a talk that I gave a few months ago to some of my younger colleagues at the University of Chicago, and was thinking about again as I was editing some papers for a journal, and thought it'd be worthwhile to go back and look through. And as I went through, I had only a few changes to make after a couple more months of editing, and thought I'd go ahead and review it and distribute it out for others. So this is my take at the current stage I am in a scientific career on how to go about reviewing papers. So I came up and I put this task or slide deck together because I've had a lot of experience being interacting with the peer review process, but never really had anyone go through and kind of help me through the process of understanding how to be a good reviewer. So, in short, I've had a lot of very good experience with reviews, but I've also had the classic kind of difficult reviews to respond to. So, what I'm going to go through today is what I've learned from this experience, both as a recipient of reviews, as a reviewer, and through the recent months as a young editor with NPJ computational materials. So, why I think I know something about this, enough to record a video on me giving a presentation about it, is that I've responded to a fair number of reviews in my time as a scientist. I've been writing papers for about a decade now, and I review typically 2 to 3 papers per month, averaging out to about 30 a year. So I've had some experience on the other side of the fence. Now, with that said, explaining why I think I'm qualified to do this, I'll give you a few reasons on why you should take a lot of this with a grain of salt. I'm still a young scientist. I've been writing papers for about a decade, but I've only been an editor for about 6 months now. And while I've got a lot of opinions that I've been thinking on and talking to others about, this doesn't replace scientific research. And peer review is something that many people who are in the science of science have studied a great deal, and I'm not as literate in those papers as I should be. Additionally, I'm also really passionate about this subject. I think bad peer review is or ruins science. So, uh, part of my presentation here is motivated by frustration, which isn't necessarily the best way to tackle science. So, I figured to be upfront about that one. So, with those kind of descriptions and introduction and kind of quality assurance statements aside, let's go to the actual meat of the talk. So I'm going to go through 3 different areas, both what I view as the point of peer review, how I peer review papers, and then some broader opinions about how I think peer review shouldn't work, or should and should not work. So we'll start out with what is peer review and how does it help improve science? So the overall motivation for this will start very philosophical. Is that science is a difficult process. Just one human mind, just one set of experiments are not enough to fully understand a problem. So if we look at this kind of classic metaphor of blind men understanding what an elephant is, you can imagine a single paper as being written from one of their perspective. Like, let's say I wrote a paper that claims elephants are ropes, and I based this on an experiment that I ran and found its similarity to having strands. So let's ask, should I accept this paper if I'm the reviewer? And I'd say, well, depends on how it's written, but probably yes. Let's say, in the simple example, I understood what the key claims in the paper were. They were backed by solid reasoning. It's reproducible. I described what I did to perform that experiment, we'll say, and I provided some examples of the other studies. So, in short, even though we know that this answer is wrong, an elephant is not a rope, this paper contributes to society's understanding of a problem because it's going to take further studies to be able to completely understand this problem. Like, let's say there's a subsequent paper that hopefully cites mine um, describing the pillar property, that this elephant is in fact a column, and sort of taking all of it together. A later paper is going to come along that hopefully will arrive to the correct answer. So it's really not about a paper being the absolute 100% solution to a problem, but as long as it contributes to this overall scientific process, then it is something that is worthy of publishing, provided it meets some other criteria. Now, to answer what those criteria are, let's talk again about the peer review process at a high level, about what it actually is. So the way that this works is a scientist will publish a paper or submit a paper to an editor. That editor will go off and find volunteer scientists to review that paper, who will then go on to give a recommendation and lead it to that editor's decision of whether this paper should be made available in its present form to the rest of the scientific readership. In fact, giving a stamp of approval to anyone who reads it, saying that at least a few other scientists agree this is not misleading and that it contributes to the scientific process. So when you're thinking as a peer reviewer, think about three things. To the editor, write a review such that it gives them enough information to make a decision. You've also got a responsibility to the author. Give them feedback of what that second pair of eyes to their study will tell them about how it can be improved further. And then to the public, make sure your review is geared towards making that paper eventually something that's going to help everyone. So actually going about doing this, I think about filling kind of 5 key steps. The first of which is I want to be very succinct. That editor needs to be able to understand if I'm giving it a yes or no and why. That why part, justifying your recommendation, is also key. Many reviewers are going to respond to the same paper, typically 2 to 3, and the editor needs to be able to weigh those decisions. So make sure your justifications are clear. And of course, in problem 3, looking at the response to your role in helping the author of that paper, be nice. If you're going to give criticism of the paper, make it constructive and clear. Also, looking at the role of ensuring that this paper is going to be useful to others, think about how you can change or modifications that could be made to the paper that will make it clearer, more understandable, and reproducible by others. And the last thing, the last advice I have under this particular rule set is speak only to your strengths. An editor is going to ask several different people with different backgrounds on what they think of the paper. So if you're a computationalist and the paper has both computational and experimental segments, feel relieved that other people are going to be responsible for the experimental part and focus your attention on where your strengths are. So given these examples, let's talk through, or these principles, let's talk through a few examples of what good and bad peer review could look like. And let's start with a good example. So let's say we're describing a paper on describing a problem or a new approach to solve a well-studied problem. And I thought that this paper should be, or the method proposed in this paper should be compared against others. So here, this text, which I'm not going to read through, but I'm going to make these slides available so you can. I give a very clear recommendation of why I think this paper, or what the editor should do. I explain why. I give a few examples of studies that have compared against a benchmark for similar kind of problems, and I give a very specific recommendation. So this here, very short review, but it hopefully fulfills everything that's needed. Hey, I like this paper. I think it really needs to be published, but some things need to be done to make it more useful to the community. I can say the same thing many different ways that aren't as good. So here, this example, I don't tell the editor specifically what I want them to do. I just say that this paper doesn't compare, so it's hard to understand whether it's useful or not. I'm going to guess that this is a revision. It could be a rejection, So you need to go back and say something in here. Another thing that this doesn't do is it doesn't say anything good about the paper. And I always try to go out of my way to ensure that I highlight something positive about that paper. Science is difficult, it is stressful. Peer review is a especially stressful part of the process. So whenever I write a review, I try to say something constructive to point out what was good about this paper. And you can even go to an extreme on that. So here I've got a very kind of crude review. I say the paper is boring, and I don't really say what they can do to improve it. So here, this fails on a number of accounts. It doesn't tell the authors what they can do to make this a more useful paper to society. So that really sums up, hopefully, with a couple examples, those major principles on how you want to write a clear review that's constructive and gives very specific points on what someone can do to make that paper better. So that we've talked about the general peer review process. I'll briefly touch on some edge cases. I don't often review for high impact journals, those Nature and Science family journals. When I do, I also add a criterion that when I'm reviewing this paper, I think about, is this a paper that someone who isn't a specialist is going to want to read? So I think about basically in terms of if this were a seminar announced at my university, would I go to it if I didn't know what the subject was already? So that's effectively the litmus test I use. Again, I will comment that this is not a particular area of reviewing I have a ton of experience in, but some of those criteria that I look about to think of whether this is a high quality paper is this is study designed in a really elegant way. Some people, even if they don't understand the science, appreciate a good experiment. Does it solve a well-known problem of something of great or something of great societal importance? Or does it present a method that, even though they showed it for one particular example, one can see right away that other people are going to need this method in order to solve some other cool problems. So this could be examples of those kind of high impact features that would make a article a shoe-in for a high impact journal. Another area, and this was something we talked a lot about with my team at the University of Chicago, is how to review for a CS conference. I've only been publishing in the CS literature for 5 years. I don't review very much for computer science conferences, and while I'm still of the opinion that they're a really well-informed way of performing the publication process, you see as results sooner. They have a rating system, and there's even for some conferences a calibration applied to reviewers based on how well they use scoring scales, whether they say just use that C to A range or whether they use all the way from 0 to 100. So I'm going to mention that I know this is another area. I'll probably re-record this talk in a year or two once I further develop my opinions on the subject, but stay tuned. Another area that I care a ton about is computational reproducibility. Now, I'm an adherent to the statement, which may sound a bit strong, that a publication is only advertisement for computational science and is not actually the information that's going to be needed to carry that method through and have it used in other places. So that's a very harsh way of saying, or well, taken out of context is a harsh way of saying that papers aren't complete for being able to understand computational science. So when I'm reviewing for a journal that I know is going to support me on this, I will go through and make the availability of code a requirement for publication, or something that I will strongly encourage as a revision. And here, just to iterate, I'm not asking for every method proposed in a paper being created into a user-friendly, well-engineered library. All I'm asking for is the code's available such that if this method is reused, it is possible to redo later. Additionally, I tend, given my background, to review a lot of machine learning papers. I also ensure that data behind those machine learning models is published because I will argue that training data is going to be used much farther into the future than the learning methods are. I have personally experienced or statements that I've made about how machine learning should be done becoming outmoded with only 2 or 3 years. So don't uh, discount the need for publishing training data such that that particular type of learning problem can be studied as we understand how to use AI better. So this wraps up what I have to say about peer review. So in short, I tend to grade papers on whether I think they're going to fit the journal scope, whether everything made sense, whether the conclusions match what they claim. And when I'm writing a review, I mark them to revise only what are when these criteria are not met. And on the other hand, conversely, I'll reject a paper if it's outside of the scope of a journal, even if it's a good piece of science. It may not be in a journal where people will find it. That I didn't understand the paper enough to tell them what needs to be fixed about it. If I did find flaws that are making me doubt the conclusions of the paper, and if I'm reviewing for a high impact journal, whether I think this will be a method that's going to be used by more than just a specialist community. So, given these recommendations on what I'm looking for in the paper, which perhaps on re-recording this talk in the future, I'll move farther up to the beginning, uh, I just want to leave you with these take-home points about what to look at when you're reviewing a paper. Think about how you're going to help the editor, the author, and the public, and make sure your review is clear, it's justified by evidence, it's constructed, it gives comments that are addressable, and it's focused on those criteria of whether a paper is going to be useful or not. So with that said, we'll talk about how I review a paper, because I tend to spend generally between an hour and 3 hours on reviewing a paper. So I try to make that process very efficient, um, starting out at the beginning of the hours with a plan on how I'm going to actually finish reviewing that paper. So the first thing I do is I read the paper at least once without putting pen to paper on what I'm going to review it, and just try to understand it and annotate what's important about that paper. I'll read that introduction to make sure I understand exactly what this paper is supposed to deliver, such that as I read through the experiments or computations, I'm using the term experiment broadly, I can ensure that those experiments are aligned with what they claim the paper to be about. I then look at the conclusions, go back to see if they match with the claims made in the introduction and the experiments. So as I'm doing that and I'm trying to answer those questions, I'm going through and I'm highlighting sections of the paper and adding specific comments that are going to be pieced together to form that review later. For example, if there's a part of the paper that doesn't make sense, I'll both mark down what part of the paper that is, and while I'm reading it, mark down how I think people could revise that section to make it better. Once I've reviewed that paper and I've got the ingredients that I'm going to use to form a paper, I'll then kind of write down the opinion on what I think about this paper, and I'm going to try to summarize it in a single paragraph because I'm intending that that first paragraph is going to be really what the editor needs to read in order to decide what they should act on based on that paper. So I'm going to explain what the paper's about. I'm going to say the key findings. That's usually a way of also providing a compliment about the paper. And then whether I think this paper should be accepted and why. So that is the introduction to the review and should be enough to stand alone itself, at least for the editor's use. The rest of the paper or the rest of the review that is a series of paragraphs just diving into those individual points I brought up in the introduction and describing why they led me to recommend a revision or a rejection, and in those paragraphs describing what they should do to fix it. So that's a lot, but I break it up into each paragraph such that it starts off with hey, here's that problem, articulate in a little more detail. I'll give an example of why that's a problem, and then I'll end with in that paragraph with how to fix it. At the end, if it's a long review, I'll write a conclusion, kind of re-emphasizing, hey, if I'm to recommend this paper for being accepted, here's are those things that I should fix. The end of the review is a section of sort of little minor things like if I think a figure needs to be adjusted for someone who's colorblind, I'll say it there because that isn't something that uh, is really going to affect my decision on whether to reject or revise the paper or not, but they're things that should be addressed. So now that we've said these big enough principles, again, introduction that's really geared towards the editor, quickly going from what is this paper about, what's good about it, are there problems that need to be addressed before acceptance, or should this paper be rejected and not considered again in its current form. We'll give some examples on what those different principles look like. So we'll talk about the first paragraph. First sentence is, what is this paper about? What is the main claim? And this is sort of a checksum to the author and the editor to see if I'm off base in my review. The second sentence, I always put something that, what is cool about this paper? The middle sentence is, I'll go through and describe perhaps what some of the problems are to give a clue on whether I'm going to reject it or accept it. And then finally end with a very specific statement on whether this paper should be accepted, rejected, or revised. So we give some examples on the side of what this could look like in text. Again, I'll refer you to the slide deck I'll post. The body paragraphs that I alluded to earlier follow another similar layout. I have a topic sentence describing what I think the reviewers need or the authors need to do to address my review. I'll give a justification, and then I'll give a specific proposal on what needs to or what could fix this. Like, let's say my problem is they didn't benchmark against other papers. I'll say, here's a specific benchmarking challenge that I know is widely used enough that it won't be a big problem. Then I can have a minor stuff question that says, hey, here are some like figures that could be revised to make them more kind of impactful. I will avoid doing like basic typographical errors in here. Copy editors are excellent at that, way better than I am. So that's not really my job of where my effort needs to be focused. Additionally, I'll provide perhaps ideas on how they can improve the explanation of their subjects. I often review a lot of methods papers. So while I'm sitting there and thinking, how does this method work? I might have an alternative way of describing it, and I'll offer that as a suggestion. And then here, especially if I find something in the paper that I really like, I'll sneak that into the um, the minor comments section. Again, never hurts to be nice to people. Publishing papers is stressful. Additionally, if I'm reviewing a paper that I've already reviewed before, I think of a couple specific actions. If they met the requirements from my first round and I thought of something else, unless it's really critical, I'm not going to suggest them to do it in another revision. Don't move the goalpost unless you really need to. Additionally, here, if they didn't meet my revisions, I try to keep an open mind about whether those revisions are really mandatory. And then only if they didn't meet a point that I think is critical will I go back and request revisions. It's rare that I go through 2 or more rounds of revision on a paper. So that brings me to the end of this section. The way that I review a paper is I go through and annotate the PDF. As I'm going through, I'll write that first paragraph, at least in Spark Notes quality, very simple. And then I'll go through, once I've read that paper enough, I will go through and write out that introduction, which is again, summarize the paper, compliment, criticize, recommend. Once I do that, I'll have a good idea about what I want to fill in for the rest of the review, which will be paragraphs, one for each point, where I summarize my complaint in one sentence. I give justification for why I think that's a problem, and then I propose a specific change on what can be done to make that paper more useful to the community. So that's how I review a paper. Now, of course, I've got opinions on how this whole process could be done better, and we'll briefly touch on those before I wrap up. So, the first of all, I think being anonymous kind of lends people to say things they wouldn't say in a more public venue, and there are some good aspects of it. Um, it does lead, or it can lead to very productive discussions where you can kind of remove the thought about um, am I impressing this specific person from a discussion of the technical subjects. Like, I don't want people responding to me differently because I think I'm an expert in the area. I want that to be removed from the discussion. Additionally, reviews are typically thrown out at the end of the process, and I put a lot of effort into these. And well, as an opinionated scientist, I think my thoughts are kind of worth sending out to others, and just throwing them away means they're not going to be useful to anybody. And finally, the review process probably dates back hundreds of years without significant change, such that the technology has advanced enough that we don't have to have a process that was modeled off of a paper being sent through the post and then letters being sent backwards. We can do better. So, where I think that these problems exist in ways that I've seen journals kind of get around them effectively is holding journals or reviews to be double blind while it matters, and then exchanging contact information or identifying the reviewers at the end of the process, such that there's really a openness around it. Additionally, journals that publish the review afterwards, I think, provide great commentary along with the paper that will be useful later. And then finally, I've reviewed for a few journals that have experimented with a direct anonymous emailing process during the revision period, such that if someone had a question about what my review meant, they could quickly contact me so that there's really no wasted time if they perhaps made a honest difference in what I was asking for. And as a consequence, I recommended going back for another round of review. Having that ability for someone to contact me quickly is a good round for it. And then for some of the papers I'll review, I'll put my email address in there if I think if it's not going to harm that double blind process. So in conclusion, the one thing to really keep in mind about the peer review process is all the scientists are on the same team, and peer review is a way of letting each scientist see more than they would otherwise. So, in summary, keep those reviews geared towards helping an editor decide on whether to publish a paper, help those authors improve it such that it's more useful to society later, and strive for a review that is clear, justified, constructive, addressable, and focused on what's relevant to making it better. I've also talked through my process for doing it and my template for um, how I write a review. So I'd encourage you, if you're experimenting with how to make your reviews more effective, of trying that out. And if you don't like it, commenting on this YouTube video, reaching out to me directly to tell me if you've got any better ideas. Because as I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, I've only been doing science for about a decade, so I have plenty more to learn about how to do it effectively. So thank you in advance.